Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Kathryn Garforth from Garforth Education, and this is the Right to Read Initiative. Today, I have the pleasure of being joined by Lisa Virtue from Virtue Speech, and we're going to be speaking about the Ontario Human Rights Commission's Right to Read public inquiry recommendations and how a speech and language pathologist can play a vital role in implementing some of those recommendations and helping teachers understand the different aspects of spoken language that come into play when it comes to teaching, reading, and writing in any language. Hi, Lisa. How are you?
Hi, I'm great. Thank you so much for having me. Like you said, things are happening in Ontario, Canada, and as a speech language pathologist, we were super excited to be named a number of times in the Right to Read report because speech language pathologist, anybody listening out there, we have been shouting from the tops of the mountains about some of the foundational skills for reading and writing. So I'm happy to be here to chat with you.
Wonderful. So I think we should start out by just defining what a speech and language pathologist is, because I think there's a lot of misinformation out there and that some teachers don't really understand how it applies to their classroom.
Absolutely. And I think we should be called communication literacy sociologists. The title of speech language pathologist certainly can be misleading, and people often think that we're just, immersed in helping kids that have a frontal lisp or can't say R. However, we are regulated healthcare professionals with a master's in communication disorders, and we're trained in all areas of communication from birth to death. So anybody that has any kind of communication need, that's what speech pathologists are trained and specialized in. And so when we think about communication, there's so many facets of communicating, but the four main modes that we communicate, although we know there's nonverbal and all of those other things, are speaking, listening, reading, and writing. So as an educational speech language pathologist, I'm embedded in the education, providing support around those areas of communication across all tiers. So we do educator workshops, we work one-on-one with teachers, we work with ECEs and EAs and principals to build capacity around supporting those areas of communication, as well as in-class support delivering one-on-one instruction and around speech language or literacy needs. So that's just one of the settings that we can work in. Speech language pathologists work in hospitals, they work in long-term care facilities, they work in private practice. So like you said, I'm a private practitioner as well. And I work one-on-one teletherapy with students, supporting communication and literacy and doing parent training.
Wonderful. Well, there's such a huge value in speech and language pathologists. I have 3 children of my own who have all benefited from SLP support in the early years and as they're growing up for various different reasons. And I think one thing that's really important to realize that when it comes to reading and writing, we need to first consider that oral language foundation because it lays the starting level for understanding what we're reading and being able to really distinguish the sounds in the spoken word. And when we're talking about English, which is a morphophonemic language, so that means that our spelling system has parts that relate to the morphemes, which are larger speech or larger units of sound that have tied to the meaning of the word, but it's also phonemic. So those are the individual speech sounds within the spoken language. And so many of our kiddos struggle with those, even if they are first language speakers.
Absolutely. And what you're saying about oral language being the foundation, as speech language pathologists, we know that learning to read and write doesn't start when kids start actually being exposed to the print. Learning to read and write begins in the womb when kids are listening. Babies are hearing speech sounds in the womb, and then they're immersed. And, human beings are so unique in that our brains are hardwired to learn oral language and to be immersed in that language and to learn the meaning of a word. And then the foundation for reading and writing and the connection is that sound map associated with that word. So, in order to be able to read and write, we need to be able to hear speech sounds, like you said, and then attach the print to those speech sounds, because written language is essentially just speech in print. And more specifically, it's individual speech sounds with a letter or letter pairs, a grapheme attached to it. So when we're looking at the development of oral language, we know how important it is for kids to be exposed to rich language so that when they can eventually sound out a word after they've learned some of those skills through explicit and systematic instruction, they have the meaning that pops up in their head, and all the context that they've learned the meaning of that word pop up in their head as well.
Definitely. Yeah. And, we're going to be going into this in more detail, but there are things that we can do that I think are really important when it comes to screening young children in those early childhood years that can alert us to potential problems later down the line. And a lot of it has to do with speech clarity and their understanding of the spoken language.
Absolutely. And when we're looking at kids and that sound processing system in the brain, that can be an indicator of later reading and writing difficulties. So if they're not hearing the difference between certain speech sounds, some kids have phonological disorders when they're speaking. So they apply sort of different patterns to their speech. They back sounds, like instead of dog, they say gog. So the indicator for learning to read later on is that they're not hearing those speech sounds, so it's harder for them to attach that letter sound correspondence accurately. And as well, to be able to take a word like dog, and in order to write it, you have to pull it apart into each individual speech sound first before you can attach that letter sound when you're learning to write. And similar for reading. So you need to be able to, know your letter sounds when you see those letters, and then hold those letter sounds in that sound processing system and blend them together. So kids that have difficulty with speech sounds and have speech sounders or phonological disorders when they're younger, or can talk about in a bit, they're at higher risk for difficulties with reading and writing because they have difficulty in that sound system in the brain. And often a red flag is their speech production or some phonological processes. And I mentioned students that have difficulty when they're growing up just really mapping the meaning with that sound map. So, in the Ontario Human Rights Commission report, they did mention some students will have that oral language difficulty. And what we know is that statistics say there's likely 2 kids in every class that has a developmental language disorder, which really in plain terms just means that kids have difficulty learning to talk and understanding language, and it persists past childhood. It's developmental, there's no known cause, and approximately 7% of the population has this. And so for those kids, they can have speech sound disorder difficulties as well, but they can talk and look like they're understanding everything and use words, but the meaning is slightly lost with them. And there's differing degrees of severity of developmental language disorder. But when we're looking at those kids, we could teach them the phonics. We can teach them the sound letter correspondences, and we can teach them to blend those sounds together to say the word like dog. But if they don't actually have the meaning and the context of those words stored in their brain, they're not comprehending what they're reading either. So, when we look at kids, it's not just that decoding side of the rope. We really need to make sure that for those kids and educators especially, because it's an invisible disorder. It's really, really hard to pick up. They can look like they're just not attending in class or they're not listening because they just miss the gist of what's happening or an instruction in the classroom. So we really need to be able to ensure that we're providing supports as parents and as educators, giving those language rich opportunities and using the right strategies for those kids, as well as the students that might need extra support with the mapping of the speech sounds and what is their mouth doing and how is their mouth saying those words.
Definitely. And I want to just take a moment to talk about, because you mentioned the rope, and what you're referring to there is Scarborough's reading rope. But before we talk about the reading rope, if we look at the simple view of reading, which is not to say that reading is simple, it's just breaking it down into 3 components. It's looking at word recognition, language comprehension. So that's looking at the understanding of the language as a separate entity to being able to read the word. Now, those are the 2 components that we need to have reading comprehension. So if you have a problem with one or both of word recognition and language comprehension, you're going to have a problem with reading comprehension. And as a speech and language pathologist, you have the ability to help support students in both of these areas. And when you go that one step further into Scarborough's reading rope, it really divides these into further subcategories of where we can see problems and have the support to help students. So when we're looking at that word recognition side of the equation, we're looking at the phonological awareness and the phonemic awareness. And that is where we're going to be looking at the pronunciation and the articulation of the speech. And this is something that I think a lot of teachers aren't aware, that your speech and language pathologist is really your best friend, because they understand the shapes that the mouth needs to make when creating these sounds. And a lot of teachers aren't aware about, voiced and unvoiced sounds and how to draw their children or their students' attention to what a voice sound is and what an unvoiced sound is. And understanding that if the student doesn't understand the shape that the mouth is making and producing those sounds, they may be saying the word incorrectly and then having a difficult time transcribing it. So do you want to just take a moment and talk about that very basic level of phonological awareness, which is phonemic awareness?
Yeah, which is the most important piece. So we have lots of other phonological awareness skills that are under that big umbrella, but we really need to get to phonemes, which are the tiniest parts of speech. And the reason we need to do that in the English language is that our language is written phoneme by phoneme. So we have 44 different speech sounds that we say with our mouth and almost 5 times as many ways to write those speech sounds. So when we think about just the basic, when we're talking about reading and writing, they are speech sounds, and we're teaching kids that sound letter correspondence, the speech sound to the letter or letters or grapheme. So when we're teaching that, we know that the place that the brain stores letters it's not hardwired. We have to teach it explicitly, systematically, and we have to do everything we can, any trick we can to map it. And one of the pieces that we really need to draw attention to is, what are our mouths doing for that pure speech sound? So if I'm teaching a student, and really and truly vowels, short vowels are particularly hard for kids to map, especially the short I and the short E. I can't tell you how many sessions I've done over the last little while that are now, okay, everybody, let's say short E. Ah, ah, ah. What's our tongue doing? What's our chin doing? What's our mouth doing? Is it back? Is it up? Is it, now let's listen. Now let's do the short I. Eh, eh. And it's such a slight variation where you have that little drop in your chin. Eh, eh. But I had a kindy class last week going, if your chin drops a little, must be I. Ah, ah, ah. Oh, your chin didn't move. Must be E. And they were like, I have a little video of this little guy going, he had some little sound boxes, so he knew how many speech sounds there were, so he knew how many letters to write. And then he got bib, B-I-B, and I have a little video, not of his face, just of his sweet little voice saying, I did it. And it's just the best feeling ever. But he's learning that his speech sound and how his mouth is moving, and to map that speech sound to the letter area of the brain. And he's doing it by us guiding him through his mouth and how his mouth moves. So you think about all those, when kids are sounding out a word to write it, or they're going to read it, they have to have the right speech sound and they have to have the right mouth movement. So if I'm teaching a student that F, and we practice listening to a sentence like a fun fairy fakes, I don't know, food. What sound did you hear at the beginning? We're training their ears to listen to it. Then we show them the letter, and then we're showing them what our mouth does. So when you mention some sounds are voiced, some sounds are unvoiced, it's really important for kids to learn that when they're making the f sound, you're biting your lip, you're blowing, and now everybody touch your throat. Is it tickling your throat? No, it's not. And many speech sounds are made almost exactly the same way, just one your voice is on and one your voice is off. So then we say, okay, let's do this. Let's make it a V and make it noisy and touch your throat. And they're all like, that tickles my finger. Okay, now let's do our F sound again. No, it didn't tickle your finger. And what we really need is that connection from the speech sound to that letter that they're going to write. So that when they go to read it, they automatically know where to put their lips. They know whether to voice or not. And let's say they're trying to read the word fish. If they say fish and then they say vish, there's no vocabulary that will light up automatically that says, oh, that's fish. We actually have to read the speech and say the speech sounds accurately, then push those speech sounds together to light up that meaning that's already stored in that vocabulary center. So, really talking about speech, and that print is just, speech in print is so important. And it's so important for educators to really focus on their mouth and what they're doing and how they're saying it, and have kids practice it and feel it and do fun games with it. And I've had some educators doing like a sound wall game where they're like, okay, I'm gonna make a sound, a speech sound. Now, what letter is it? So there's mouth shapes on the wall to help the kids. They're listening with their ears, and then they're saying it and they're feeling it. So it's just such a critical step in learning to read and write.
And unfortunately, the vast majority of teachers out there have had zero training in this whatsoever. And that's a huge disservice to them and their students. So unfortunately, a lot of teachers are on this learning journey to learn about articulatory gestures and, the difference between a voiced and unvoiced sound. And then, they get that little light bulb like, oh, I wish I knew this from the beginning, which is okay. And, I think everybody has that little bit of regret sometimes when they learn this stuff, because they see that it can have such a huge improvement on some of their kids, especially those struggling readers and those students that are English language learners, because there are 44 phonemes in the English language, Not every language has 44 phonemes or the same phonemes that English has. So when you're working with students that have English as an additional language, you need to be aware that to them, some sounds like the O and the might actually be the same sound in their home language.
Absolutely. And, what we're trying to do with kids that are dual language learners is we know that systematic, explicit phonemic awareness and phonics instruction works for them as well. We know that. There's an added layer of teaching them the vocabulary and mapping the vocabulary and mapping the vocabulary maps so that when they go to read an English word, they have that vocabulary map to light up. So, we know that for those kids, talking about what your mouth is doing is so important to map those letter sounds. However, I do want to say that if some kids are unable to make a sound like the TH sound, but they're able to learn to read the word and attach, some kids will say dis, not this. To me, that's not an error if they know what they're reading. I don't count that as an error. So we have to consider some of those pieces as normal articulation differences. It's just really, are we mapping the vocabulary and the sound map and those phonemes and teaching them how to attach sound letter correspondences at the same time? But yeah, absolutely. Our dual language learners definitely need those strategies. And I was telling you before we started that the Ontario government there is a 2022 effective early reading instruction, a teacher's guide that's just been released, I believe. And it has a lot of the pieces around structured literacy and the vocabulary and comprehension and phonics and phonemic awareness and fluency in it. So it's a promising step in our province, and hopefully the rest of the country will be following behind. But we know that a lot of the explicit and systematic pieces work for our dual language learners as well. And really, what this is all about is for our students to visualize themselves and be proud and confident and see themselves as readers and writers. And, I know in my job, I've had the pleasure of experiencing kids, that I did it, I'm a reader, or kids that wouldn't hold a pencil or a pen before and now proudly trying to write words with the right supports in place around oral language, the speech sounds and the phonemes, and the explicit and systematic instruction of the phonics and phonemic awareness for all our learners, right? To come to school and be like, I'm a reader and I'm a writer this is why we're here.
Yeah, and I think something that is important to note that there's a lot of discussion going on about phonemic awareness in the field, whether it's good, whether it's bad, the level of explicit instruction. And one of the concerns that's being mentioned is when it comes to dialect and accent for some of these programs that can be purchased. And, it's understanding that phonemic awareness is definitely an essential component of reading. There is no argument there, but it's the quantity and quality of instruction that is important. And when we're looking at the articulatory gestures and getting children to maybe look at a mirror and highlighting how we pronounce the sound and how it's pronounced in relation to the spelling of the word, that is different than saying, this is how you have to do it. That is getting them to understand why the word is spelt the way it's spelt, how it is said in part of the English speaking world that dictated the spelling, and giving them that understanding.
Absolutely. And that's why when we're looking at our dual language learners, we're looking at mapping the vocabulary. And we know, like, if I say the word fish, you're visualizing a fish, right? So we know that when kids learn that word, that sound map is attached to it. that chunk is attached to it. So we're mapping that for our dual language learners so that when they can learn the sound letter correspondences for f, ish, and they can blend it together, which is that phonemic blending, that we really, the ultimate goal is for them to go, aha, I understand what I just read. So all of those pieces and helping them map it. And you bring up, purchasing a program. We know there's places out there that are calling themselves the science of reading and selling packages. I'm Orton Gillingham trained, so I understand that it's not, you're never going to have this one perfect program that you can just layer on every single student, every single classroom. I think the important piece is really understanding how the brain learns how to read and the foundational skills we need to look for. We need to look for the vocabulary and the comprehension, that rich oral language being mapped. We need to look for the sound map being there. And, knowing that the articulation is such a key critical piece of that. And then we need to look at how are our students learning their sound letter correspondences. And once they learn them, can they push those sounds together to identify the word to read, or can they pull the word apart into the individual speech sounds to then know what letter to write? So it's a process, not a program, and it's based on foundational skills. And for our educators, you said earlier that there's some feelings, right? And our educators are just trying their best, and nobody taught them this stuff. There was nobody there in teachers' college to teach them about phonemes or the tiniest parts of speech or voiced and unvoiced speech sounds. And in my experience, educators they're just sponges, especially right now in Ontario. They're like, I know our speech pathologists at our school board are just being pulled in all the time because it's finally being recognized that, by the world, how brains learn how to read. And they're really looking for more information on those foundational skills and how speech and language and phonemic awareness, so getting to that tiniest parts of speech, how important that is.
Definitely. So we've talked about the smallest level, but let's kind of move up to another level of phonological awareness that is important. And that is the blending and segmenting of those phonemes, because that's what we're getting children to do when we're asking them to sound words out, whether we're asking them to sound them out as they're reading them or when they're spelling them. And so the fancy word for when they're reading them is decoding. So we're wanting them to decode and blend the phonemes together. And when we're asking them to spell, we want them to encode and segment the phonemes and decide which grapheme or letter combination is represented and record that as they encode the spelling for the word.
Yeah, I mean, it's so important. So if we think about the steps to writing a word, even, and in the earlier grades when kids are in that process of learning to read and learning to write, the way I was trained was that we really need to master that consonant, vowel, consonant word form with short vowels because they are the hardest. And we want kids to be quick and proficient in those phonics skills so that when we start layering on all those other graphemes and rules and prefixes and suffixes, kids are spending less of their cognitive energy on, what sound letter correspondence or what speech sound, when I see the B, what speech sound do I say? We want it just to be quick and automatic. So when we think of that basic word level reading, if a child was going to or wanted to, let's say, write the word cat, first they have to have the word. We have to have exposed them richly to that word. They have to have that nice sound map for that word, cat. So then they have to be able to, like you said, segment to write. They have to be able to go cat, k, a, t. How many speech sounds are there? 3. And this is our target for that umbrella term of phonological awareness. We want to get to this phoneme level, or the tiniest parts of speech. And I've said it before, but why? Because the way we write in our English language is each speech sound has a grapheme or letter or letters associated with it. So if they're writing cat, they need to first be able to pull that word apart, k, a, t, and then go k, k, k. Okay, my voice is off. I've practiced this one with my teacher lots. We've had it in over and over again. We've done lots of words. K, k, k. My tongue's at the back. I learned that as C. So that speech sound is C. And whether they learned the rule that the K or C rule yet? Maybe not. It doesn't matter. We just want them to write what they've learned, first of all. And then, ah. Oh, I felt my chin go way down. My lips are back. That's an A. And t, t, t. Oh, my voice is off. My tongue is up. That's a T. So that's the process for writing. And you can see in that how important it is for kids to be able to pull that word cat apart into each individual speech sound, and that's segmenting to that phoneme level, the tiniest parts of speech. And it's a similar process for reading. Kids first need to know automatically when they, we don't want to introduce them to the whole alphabet or all the possible graphemes and then say, now let's try reading a word. We just need a few. And so let's say they're going to read the word cat. They need to know that when they see a C, they keep their voice off. It's a k, k, tongue at the back sound, k. And then when they see an A. Their mouth needs to be in the right shape, and they need to have learned that sound letter correspondence with that speech sound, so that it's automatic. And then t, so they sound it out, k, t. Then, and nothing lights up in their brain yet. They need to be able to push those speech sounds together to say that whole word map, cat, before their brain goes, oh, yeah, cat, and all the images and experiences and context that they learned that word pop up. So when we look at that phoneme level, it's so critical that there are other phonological awareness skills under the umbrella. And I know there's lots of discussion around which ones we should target and which ones we shouldn't. The International Dyslexia Association of Ontario has a Padlet out right now with some really great resources on do this, not this. And there is some information that, even syllables, like how much are we working on those compared to working on that phoneme level? We know that's not hardwired. Kids aren't born talking k, a, t. We have to teach it. That's another explicit systematic teaching skill, is to get to the just individual speech sounds. And it's hard for kids because when we say the word, let's say the word nose, the O is different in nose than top. And the reason is there's co-articulation. So when we say a word, our articulators, our mouth, our tongue, our lips, our nose, already starting to move towards that next sound. So a sound like N, I call it, it's a sound stealer with the little kids that I work with. I'm like, that N, there comes out your nose. It's going to grab the O and go, no, come out the nose. So it sounds a little different. Or if you think about the word pat and pan, so that N is stealing some of the air out. So it's hard for kids to take words and put them in their pure individual speech sounds, but it's really, really important, because if they don't, and if they're sounding out pan and they say pa, a, na, then when they blend it together, that auditory, we're holding those auditory sounds that we just sounded out. When we blend it together, it's going to be paena, paena. I don't know what that is. They're not going to have the correct meaning. We want them to go pan. Eventually, we want kids to be successively blending as they read words, but that comes with lots and lots and lots and lots of practice.
Yes, it does, but it's understanding that it needs to be there so that they have the appropriate foundation. And I know when I'm talking about phonemic awareness and phonological awareness, one thing that I like to highlight is that anyone who can comprehend spoken language has an unconscious awareness of phonemic awareness, if it's a morphophonemic language or a phonemic language. But when we're teaching reading and writing, we're trying to bring that unconscious awareness to the conscious level because we're asking them to manipulate it. Now, not all language systems out there have or require phonemic awareness. Sometimes their writing system has it on a larger segment level.
Yeah, and I'll be the first one to say I don't speak any other languages and I haven't studied any other languages, but I do know that there are some languages that write in whole words. You know, I think Chinese writes in whole words, so they don't have to, in order to learn to read and write, break it down until those tiniest parts of speech are learned to push it together. But our English language, you know, whoever decided to invent the English language, they decided to take each individual speech sound and go, this is the symbol I'm going to use for it here. And then because we pull from so many other languages, you know, the Y doesn't just say y, it says E and I sometimes. And that's because we pull from so many other languages as well. So yes, in other languages. And then there's some languages that, you know, like Spanish, I can read a Spanish passage quite fluently and even think that I have a little bit of a, you know, I can put a little bit of an accent to it. I have no idea what I'm reading because it's more of a one-to-one correspondence. I don't know if any of their graphemes have more than one phoneme for it. I don't know enough about it, but I know I can read it quite fluently. But I have no idea what I've just read. And that's that language piece that's so important.
Definitely. Definitely. And that's why it's so interesting. I mean, the problem with the English language is there are 44 phonemes with 26 graphemes. So there are 26 letters that need to be used to cover up to 44 different sounds. So there can't just be one letter per sound. And there are sometimes when we have 2, 3, even 4 letters representing one speech sound. Now, at the beginning of reading instruction, we don't want to complicate things saying, okay, well, you know what? OUGH.
No.
One of the ways that we can spell ooh, as in through. But, you know, these are things that we build up to. So it's making sure that there's a logic to how we're teaching these correspondence, and we're wanting to get the most common ones in first, and then building up to a point where we are more explicit about teaching the other letter sound correspondences and, you know, the more complex graphemes.
Yeah, and layering in the morphology, you know, from the beginning, really, what do kids need in kindy? They need to know, you know, plurals, maybe ing, you know, like
ED.
maybe ed, yeah, maybe ed. But in kindergarten, we don't need to teach that Y says in bicycle. We don't need to, we can teach that as a sort of irregularly mapped word for them at that time if we come across it. But what we're trying to do is explicitly teach this speech sound says k, and you write it with a C. Then we give them this speech sound ah is written by an O. Then you give ah is an A, and then you give D, and then look at all the words you can read and write with COAD. I mean, that's recipe for reading, scope and sequence, and there's lots out there. But the main idea with any scope and sequence really should be, we want kids to learn the highest the sounds that are occurring the most for them, the individual speech sounds with a grapheme, and get them really automatic with reading and writing consonant, vowel, consonant words, so that when we're teaching them the magic E rule, or, you know, the ing, ang, unk as chunks, or consonant blends, we want them to be like, I know the speech sounds and I know how to say cat, dog, you know, mat. So when I go to say mate, there's no energy in what speech sound is M. No, I know it automatically. What speech sound is t. So all the energy kids are spending are applying that one new rule at a time, that one new phonics rule, and learning the speech pattern to the one phonics rule and just continually mapping. The way I learned was you go as slow as you need to and as fast as you can with kids.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Now let's talk about the connections that we can make between reading, spelling, and using a speech and language pathologist in the classroom.
Yeah, so I mean, speech language pathologists in the classroom can support, everything that we've been talking about, but also guiding, initial assessment. So anytime, I think about a classroom or a teacher asking, what do I do with my kids? Like science of reading, what do we do? I think, where are your kids, number one? Where are their, have you screened their phonemic awareness? Can they segment words? Can they blend words? What is their repertoire of sound letter correspondences? How are your kids producing speech sounds? Let's talk about that initial screening or assessment. And I was quite happy that the Ontario Human Rights Commission report has some recommendations around frequency of screening. Because we need to be able to look at where kids are, not just for your individual student progress, but for a whole class. Where are we going to start with phonemic awareness? Are our kids can they not even get any part of that? Do we need to just start and make it fun originally and then move as quickly as we can to that phoneme level where they're pulling words apart into each speech sound or pushing those speech sounds together? And for phonics too, where are your kids? What sound letter correspondence do they kind of know that we just need to make automatic? And which ones should you be kind of leaving out for a little bit because you need to explicitly teach that letter and this speech sound make a connection? So, for speech language pathologists, really guiding that, the background information and how the brain learns how to read with the oral language and the phonemes. But as well, looking at assessment. And I know there's other professionals in the school system that do that as well. Psychologists, psychometrists do that as well. They look at some of those assessments. But really, that's the first step for educators, is getting a handle on where their kids are. And then having that repertoire, that kind of, whole class picture of where their kids are, or small group or individual. We need to know where kids are in reading and writing before we start. So, speech language pathologists certainly can support that. And then, like you said earlier, when we look at the national reading panels, 5 main pillars, it's vocabulary, speech paths. That's our jam, is how do we richly teach vocabulary? Not just, if I'm going to say gather at the carpet, gather means get together. No, I'm going to have kids we're going to draw pictures about it. We're going to map it out. We're going to talk to each other about, what does gather mean? Have you heard it at your house? Have you heard a gather in a shirt? And then in math, you're going to practice. I want you to use the word gather when you're asking your friends to clean up. Outside, okay, it's time to gather. What did that mean? That was kind of different than in the classroom, wasn't it? So when we think about the 5 pillars, we've got vocabulary, we've got the comprehension. I mean, again, the strategies to improve comprehension, the inferencing, the phonemic awareness. We've talked about that so much today. The phonics, many of our SLPs are trained in structured literacy, and, Orton Gillingham is probably one of the best things for me as a speech pathologist, because it just really tied everything together into a beautiful package. And then the fluency piece too, we can support all of those different areas for educators in programming and assessment, in modeling strategies, and also with parent education. So I think there's a lot that our SLPs can do to help and support our educators in the school system.
Yeah, and it's good to know about the professionals out there that you have access to as a classroom teacher through your board, because, well, it's knowledge that you may not have. And yes, you can go to all these online trainings and events, but sometimes it's helpful to just have that person that you can say, hey, can you show me this in a little bit more detail? That's right there beside you and can help facilitate your learning and provide the support where you need it. So understanding that the speech and language pathologist at your school within your district can provide that assistance is really helpful.
And really it's about the kids in your class, right? I mean, that's what teachers, that's what they want. That's what educators, ECs, EAs, principals, resource teachers, that's what they want. It's not about, do I know it or do I not know it? They're like, help me with the peeps in my class, because if anything I know about educators working in the education system so long, they just want their kids to succeed. That is their goal, right? So with the right tools, they can, they can really support their kids in reading and writing.
Definitely.
Language, yeah.
And understanding that there's that teacher, or that professional that can come in and parachute in and provide the support and even help them teach a lesson on some of these activities so they can see it in their classroom with their students and build on that is definitely helpful.
Yeah, it's a collaborative relationship. I know in Ontario, SLPs working in education it's really, really hard to describe our job because we're embedded in education. We're not just go and see one student and pull them out. Like sometimes we do that, and sometimes we're in the classroom with the whole class, and sometimes we're doing lunch and learns, and sometimes we're, doing after school NTIP presentations. Anything, speech paths are pretty passionate humans, and we certainly care about everybody that we work with, especially the educators, and empowering them to be have the skills and the passion to see the progress with their kids, to be in classrooms and hear those kids say, I did it, and see the smiles on the educator's face. I mean, that's why we do what we do.
And the training that a speech and language pathologist gets heightens your acuity to picking up these subtleties that teachers may just pass off because they haven't had that same training, and be able to identify the kids that are actually really struggling with the language component, or just saying, hey, you know what, there's this kid in my class I'm just not too sure about. Can you take 10 minutes? Because really, when you know what you're doing, 10 minutes with a student can tell you a lot.
Yeah. And, we are regulated, we're regulated healthcare professionals. So we can't just be like, well, I'm going to tell you what to do with Johnny. We do have to have consent, but, we can provide general strategies. Absolutely. If I have kids that are struggling with articulation, what are some good strategies? Or if I have kids that are struggling with this, and just spending time in the class and modeling whole class strategies, and learning. I mean, I learn more every day from educators and their ability. I'm not an educator, so I sometimes see that whole class behavior, like the management, and when you walk into a room and everybody's quiet and the teacher's calm, and I think, how did you do that? It's so beautiful. I don't have all of those skills, and educators, it's an art, and I learn from them every day too. That's for sure.
Yeah. Well, and as a speech and language pathologist working in the classroom, it doesn't mean you're going to give out a diagnosis to every student. It just means you're providing the support that they need. And that's the other thing, that we see across all of the recommendations in the report, is that we're identifying students for support and not providing a diagnosis to every student that possibly could potentially have it at a young age. We're interested in making sure they get the support that they need to succeed, so they don't need a diagnosis in the future.
Right. If it's, I mean, it's been said a number of times about reading and writing, is that if you have too many kids in requiring tier 2 intervention, it's a tier 1 problem. So I'm really optimistic in Ontario about, we have a new curriculum that is said to be coming out in 2023 that'll incorporate these recommendations. And I'm optimistic that, we're going to see more kids coming out of kindy, being able to have that automatic word level reading and writing with consonant, vowel, consonant words with their basic sound letter concepts, so that, you know, there are more resources for kids that truly have an underlying dyslexia or developmental language disorder, or require use of an augmentative communication system or anything else. You know, really it's about freeing up resources, and teachers too. Think about kids independently reading and writing. And I've experienced that just in my role, is that, oh, educators saying, I have fewer kids asking me, how do you write blank? So if we can get kids at an earlier age, especially in that learning to read, learning to write phase, you know, not only are we freeing up resources, we're creating, you know, kids that have strong identity as readers and writers. They're confident and proud of them. They feel good about coming to school. And then we're giving them the highest level of access to language. Because when kids flip from learning to read to reading to learn, they're starting to learn and map new vocabulary on their own. And that gives them access to jobs and opportunities in life that they wouldn't have. So it's a really large picture. And like I said, I don't know, I'm optimistic about Ontario, and especially the educators I've been working with. They're so phenomenal and they're so excited about this stuff and they're just sponges. They're just like taking it on and implementing things it's beautiful.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today. For those of you listening live, we will be putting the links that Lisa mentioned in the replay, so that you can access them. And it will be available as a replay on the Right to Read Initiative YouTube channel, website, and available as a podcast within the next few days. But before we go, there's just one question about the relationship between the brain and mispronunciation. And I mean, the first thing that I always think of is making sure we get hearing tested.
Number one. Number one. Number one. And then really after that, it's if hearing is within normal limits, it's a differential diagnosis to determine what's going on. But everything we do is brain-based. And there's a motor component to speech as well. So just like some kids don't have great coordination with their feet, some kids don't have really good coordination with their mouth, and they need additional support for that motor. It could be coordination, it could be strength and tone, or it could be that phonological system in the brain. Are they hearing? Is their brain processing bread so that they can produce bread? So, you know, I would say if you're unsure of what the underlying cause is for mispronunciation, talk to your speech language pathologist.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was such a pleasure.